Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this live stream event, Moving from Advocacy to Action. I am Sabrina, your host and moderator. I'm an assistant professor here at UNC Wilmington. On behalf of Sophie, we are both excited and extremely pleased by the overwhelming interest in today's live stream event. Thank you so much for being here. Today's live stream event will feature a preview of Sophie's 2021 Virtual Advocacy Summit. The theme for this year's summit is Health Education, Advancing Health Equity at Every Level, and will be held October 13th through 14th of this year. Congressional visits will take place October 18th through the 19th. Remember to register by September 13th to take advantage of early bird prices if you'd like, and if you'd like for Sophie to schedule your congressional visits for you. I would now like to briefly introduce today's speakers. Dan Shi directs the National Political Strategy and Grant Fundraising for the Student PIRGs, or Public Interest Research Group. And I'm moving around so that my lights can come back on in my office, maybe. Dan has managed successful campaigns from coast to coast to cap global warming pollution, fight the high cost of higher education, and make voting more accessible for students. She has recruited and trained hundreds of students and staff on public interest campaigns and got her start as an intern with CalPERS students. Dan lives in St. Petersburg, Florida, where she is an avid cyclist and climber. Kimberly Jones has more than a decade of experience in advocating for low-income, first-generation students and students of color. Has established herself as a credible voice within policy circles in Washington, D.C. Currently, she serves as Executive Vice President at the Council of Opportunity in Education, or COE. In this role, she oversees the day-to-day operations of the council, including representation of students served by the federal TRIO programs, or for the U.S. Congress, U.S. Department of Education, and all government agencies. Oversight of the program and professional development offerings for college access and success professionals, the organization's fiscal and information technology, and the development and implementation of all print and digital communications of COE. She's just a little busy, just a little bit. She is the inaugural advisory board member for Black History 365, a comprehensive textbook and curriculum guide designed for students and educators that spans the breadth of Black American history. Gabrielle is a project specialist at the National LGBT Cancer Network and is based in Salt Lake City, Utah. His work focuses on LGBTQ tobacco initiatives and helping build and organize coalitions. For over 10 years, Gabe has worked in tobacco prevention and cessation and LGBTQ exercise science. He received his bachelor's degree in exercise science from Augsburg University and is currently working on his master's of public health at Utah State University. Gabe is passionate about LGBTQ health, reducing health disparities, and increasing scientific literacy. In his free time, whenever that is, Gabe enjoys reading, cooking, and traveling. Gabe also identifies as an Ashkenazi Jew and trans as well as queer. Dr. Megan Smith is an associate professor in the Department of Community and Environmental Health at Boise State University. Dr. Smith received her PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from West Virginia University. She has a teaching degree from California State University, Chico, and a BA in Psychology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Smith's work builds on education, human development, and public health science to study the contextual factors that promote or thwart health outcomes for young people. Say that 3 times fast. A former K-12 teacher, she often focuses on the school environment. While working for the West Virginia University School of Public Health, she served as Director of Child and Adolescent Health Initiatives for the Prevention Research Center. She is committed to public health advocacy and deeply believes in the mission of public health professionals to continue to advocate for and champion equity and health for all. I'd also like to add that Dr. Smith is the 2021-2022 Sophie Advocacy Resolutions Committee co-chair. Thank you all and welcome again to our panelists. I'd like to start off today's conversation by asking a few questions of our speakers. For those of you who are joining us from the virtual world, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll get to those as well. So to kick us off, I'd like to ask Kim and Megan, what does advocacy mean to you?
So good morning, or I guess no, afternoon at this point. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me and allowing me to be on this esteemed panel. I always think of advocacy as really consisting of three distinct parts, and I believe there's a slide to illustrate that. There's three different types of advocacy and three different ways you can go about it. There's sort of the first level, which is information sharing, simply telling a lawmaker about what it is that you do. This is the type of program we're working on. This is what your federal funding, the dollars you're investing in the program, this is what it's doing. Sort of the second level is actual lobbying, and that's probably what most people think of when they think of advocacy. That's when you're actually asking for a lawmaker to take action on a piece of legislation. So Congressman Smith, please vote yes on Bill 1234. And so that's primarily what people think of, I would say, when it comes to advocacy. Then there's a third piece, which people, I think, also think of when they think of politics, but they don't recognize it as part of advocacy, and that's political activity. Because the reality is, you have a lot of say-so in who is actually sitting in office. And so political activity is everything from, door knocking and canvassing to get out the vote efforts to participating in political campaigns as far as giving donations to members that you want to see elected in or folks you want to see voted out. So actually getting involved in electioneering. So those are, in my opinion, the three different components of advocacy.
Yeah, I think that really covers it. I would add that sometimes we forget about the training component. So actually training other people to have advocacy skills can be part of advocacy, because then you're sort of amplifying your voice. I think that probably fits under your political activity and information sharing, Kimberly. So yeah, I think that's advocacy really, especially from a public health perspective, I think is our main role. That's why I'm so glad to see it added to the Sophe competencies for health educators, because in public health, we see issues, and what we do is we really push forward on sort of what I would say is the status quo. And that's part of advocacy, right? We see something wrong in the environment and it's status quo, and we have to push back against that.
Thank you all for that. What about your first advocacy experience? Can you tell us a bit more about your first time advocating for something?
Yeah, I can definitely share my experiences with getting into advocacy work. So I first got involved when I was in middle school. So that was about 14-ish so years ago. So a very long time ago. And I actually had a sister who was smoking, and then she also had a substance use disorder. And I was just trying to find resources to help her quit these things and try to be better, and got involved with the Utah Department of Health with their tobacco programming. And what do you know, 13 years later, I'm still in this type of work. But even though the work was first focused on youth, I realized, especially here in Utah and in other states as well, that LGBTQ communities also smoke at very, very high rates. And so I kind of shifted from youth to then focusing on the LGBTQ community. And so I think my very first advocacy experience was testifying to expand the Utah Indoor Clean Air Act to include hookahs and electronic cigarettes, and it was terrifying. I remember I was not good at public speaking. I was absolutely terrified, but it was great. It ended up passing, and so that was one of my very first experiences. And I think it was great because, being so young and hearing about the political climate and all of these things, and being too young to vote, it was a very cool way of being involved and seeing how my efforts went into actually passing laws. So that was a very uplifting experience for me.
That's so cool.
I also started advocacy 14 years ago, but I was several years out of law school by then, not middle school, just so you know.
I got my start in high school, I'll say, trying to get rid of standardized tests. I really didn't like SATs. as a child of Asian immigrant parents. And I wrote a letter. They sent me a little kit. Unfortunately, lost that campaign. And then the second thing I did was go door knocking and phone banking for a local candidate I was into. Also lost that campaign. So I think, the training piece is so important, as Megan is noting, because your first political experience can either launch you into it because you're like, that's interesting, I won, it was fun, I feel like I'm competent at this, or you can come out of it going, wow, that was horrible and I don't want to do that again, I'm going to do something else. So I think I had like good positive training experiences, but I didn't really win until I was in college, and I got involved with the PIRGs, which we basically train college students how to run political campaigns. And I do want to note that I think a lot of people think advocacy and lobbying as like the meeting that you do with the elected official. And I think that's kind of like, if you think of a person like shooting a bow and arrow, the meeting you do is like how sharp your arrow is. It's really important. You got to have a sharp arrow, but like actually all the work that you put into actually aiming that arrow and like building up your muscles and like having the right stance and pointing in the right place, like all of that is actually part of lobbying and advocacy, as well as thinking about what am I bringing to this lobby meeting? How am I showing the support of the community? So a lot of the students that we work with, and certainly my perception in college was like, oh, I just need to meet with them. Why aren't they doing what I want? And so I think it took a little while to learn that actually you don't even need to meet with them. If you say, hey, I got 1,000 petitions in your district, how do you feel about that? They pretty much will go, can I meet with you? What do you want? What do you want me to co-sponsor? So it's really about that campaign at the end of the day. And so that's how I got involved. And I think, it's been interesting to think about how much the organizations I've worked with have helped me learn about that. So I'm excited for this conference that's coming up. Encourage you to, get involved with it, because you can learn all the things that I have probably faster.
Way to plug the Advocacy Summit. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, Megan, like to comment?
Yeah. Oh, yay, Omar, you're looking forward to the summit. That's so awesome to see that up here. Thanks for sharing that. We're looking forward to having you there. Yeah, so the first thing I did was, I think it was in 5th grade, there was some city council meeting about something. I don't even know. I don't remember what it was about. I think I was put up to it, but I read my speech as a 5th grader. But clearly that wasn't incredibly memorable. And then I really got engaged at, Santa Cruz, working there. And then as an adult, kind of re-put my head in the game and started focusing on the personal professional intersections of my life. And so one of the most, I guess I learned all the lessons on the ground was when we worked on creating a non-discrimination ordinance in West Virginia. So you can imagine there were some uphill challenges there, but we were successfully able to get our city to pass a non-discrimination ordinance, and then we're working statewide, and I think we have 14 cities now online for the non-discrimination ordinance, which seems small. But is big. Sometimes you can make a really big impact locally in the actual lives of people who actually live in that place. If you can't make a state or a federal change, you can really change the lives of the city or county that you're living in.
Thank you all for that. Any other comments about your first advocacy experience before we move on? So what about your biggest pitfall? What's the biggest pitfall that maybe you have experienced, or the biggest pitfall that you see in first-time or new advocates?
I can go. So I tell my advocacy, my community, my grassroots folks this every year. We have our fly-in in the spring. And I tell them every year, if you're just going to come to our event, go on Capitol Hill, and then you're not going to think about this again until next year, then just go see some cherry blossoms, because this is not a one and done kind of opportunity. It's not something you can do once. Just like the bow and arrow example that Dan gave, that bow and arrow, that's a less than 30-second event. And likewise, your meeting in the Hill, you might get 20 minutes or 30 minutes. You're not going to effectively impact change in one meeting. There's so many different components, and the meeting is a critical piece of that, but it's just one small piece. And there's so much work that has to happen back home in the district, at the state level, working with the staff back home, in the office, follow-ups. There's just so many multiple pieces that I think the biggest mistake, and you see it, not so much right now because the Capitol's still pretty much on lockdown, but I would always see different groups. They'd be on the Hill, they'd have their buttons and their t-shirts and their pins, and you could tell they were so excited. And I would think to myself, and what are they going to do after this? How many people are going to make phone calls and follow up emails and keep being in touch with those members of Congress and their staff after this conference is over? So I would say that's the biggest pitfall, is thinking that the day of advocacy or your day on the Hill is it.
Thank you for that, Kimberly. Others?
On the day of advocacy, I think the number one pitfall I see is people thinking they have to be experts. You don't have to be an expert. You're, I mean, a lot of you are experts, but if you aren't, your personal story is going to be more memorable to that staffer than anything else. They get lobbyists all freaking day, right? They get people like me all day. Oh, the political director of some nonprofit, whatever. You're one of 20 that I'm seeing today, right? Really what they want to hear is like, how does this impact you, right? Like how does not having funding for your program impact you? How does not having funding impact your community? And telling those stories, that's what's going to be memorable. But I think the second thing is like, join a group. It's a huge pitfall. It's like you can start it all on your own, but it's just going to be so much harder. There probably is someone around you that's doing something similar, and that can just help you, get grounded. And it may be the case that your issue doesn't have a group, but at least you can learn how it works before you go and start your own thing.
We have a question from one of our viewers. What is the best way for students with no experience to get involved in advocacy efforts? So Gabe, why don't we, I think I heard someone's voice, but I'd like to kick it off with Gabe.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like the best way to get involved with no experience is to just get involved. I think, honestly, it really is like, Megan was doing things in 5th grade and, we're all doing these things at different ages. And I think, we saw a problem and we were like, okay, how can we get involved in this? And I think just taking that step and just getting involved is the biggest and best way that you can actually get involved in advocacy work. I know for a lot of the things I was involved in, at first started out with just doing a lot of education events, and then it turned into advocacy. So even if you find like a club you want to be a part of or some professional organization, sometimes it just builds up to advocacy work. So I think the biggest step is to just get involved.
Yeah, I think just piggybacking on that, I think there are some, sort of like Dawn and Gabe have already said, there are some larger organizations. For instance, one of the organizations I do advocacy work with is Save the Children Action Network. And that group, because they're so large and because advocacy is one of their goals, they have a website that's available to anybody in the public, and you can sign up and figure out, how deep do you want to get as your first experience, right? Do you want to sign up and go straight to, the Capitol and start talking there, or do you want to start sort of a hometown meeting with just other folks interested in getting the vote out? And they kind of give you a menu of options. And I think there are lots of large groups like that, for instance, the Trevor Project, who give you sort of get your toes wet advocacy experiences. And then if you like that, they're willing for you to go, all the way into the swimming pool. And so I would say those are ways. And then if you're connected to a college campus in some way, I do a Google search on the professors working there, particularly around, advocacy related type, gender studies, public health, those kinds of social work, those kind of programs will have probably at least a couple of faculty members doing advocacy work, and then they might be able to connect you to some local opportunities.
I got to plug PIRG. We've got organizers in 32 states working on tons of issues. Like right after this, we're running a national fund bank on COVID vaccine education for college students. So like whatever state you're in, we have remote internships, and some of them are in person. I got like 9 units for PIRG my senior year. Really helped me graduate. So if you need some units too, it can help you.
Any additional thoughts on the best way for students to get involved?
And I think even just being here today, just soaking up, like Gabe says, soaking up as much information as you can get. And when you do join these efforts, there's going to be the veterans who are there. Talk to them. Take them out to coffee. People love to talk about themselves. Ask them how they got started, and just soak up as much information as you can, because they have the experience. They can tell you the war stories and those little tips. I mean, this is an art. It's not a science. And so just really sitting at the feet of those who've done it before you, because it's also about relationship building. I don't think we've talked about that a lot yet. But advocacy, it's of relationships. You know, members of Congress, members of your Board of Aldermen, your state legislature, they're people. And regardless of all the craziness, they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody else. And they have aunties, brothers, sisters, cousins, neighbors. And at the end of the day, sometimes just getting to them to get your point across is about getting to them through an auntie, a cousin, a sister, a relative. So definitely that networking piece is really important too.
I will just say that as we're on the like getting new and involved in advocacy, Kimberly, you reminded me that I highly recommend, if this is your first endeavor into advocacy, that you choose one thing to work on. I think a lot of advocates, newer advocates, I made this mistake myself. I was like, oh, I haven't been paying attention to the world and everything's on fire. And I tried to do all the things and I just burned out real quick. So I would say try to choose one thing and sort of start there, because then you can really build those relationships and focus. Yeah, I'm an example of the splatter paint approach that did not work.
Thank you, Megan. And we have another question from our viewers. And Dan, this is for you. So I know you can see it on your screen, so why don't you chime in and give us a response?
Yeah, studentpirgs.org, PIRGS. We have a terrible name, I will acknowledge. We were started in 1971. Everyone was all about bad acronyms then, but now too many people know us. Barack Obama's first job out of college, NIPIRG organizer. So you can apply for an internship at studentpirgs.org.
Thank you so much. What are some tips around storytelling? And I'm obviously you all can see this, but I'd like to read it for those maybe who are only using the audio. What are some tips around storytelling that get the attention of your audience or Hill staff members?
I would say details and specificity. I can't remember what other panelists said it, but you know, we come in there as advocates with our fact sheets and our statistics. But I promise you, the thing that staffer member is going to remember, they're going to remember the name of the person you talked about, the condition that they had, and the outcome of that story. That's what they're going to really remember, and that's going to drive home your point. So you don't want to be general. You want to be, I mean, don't tell people's business, but you want to be as specific as you can in sharing a story to really illustrate your point. And so I advocate for low-income first-generation to college students. And so when we go on the Hill, I bring with me, if not the student, then the educator who worked with the student. And they will tell very specific stories about how this young person from this community, what their family life was like, what the obstacles they encountered were, what was the name of the school in the town that they went to, so that the members really able to connect it to where the area they represent. And now that person's a homeowner in this community, and they live on such and such street, and they work for such and such corporation in this town. Details, 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 details.
I think that's perfect. And if you can connect that with a killer fact, like, you know, I experienced this terrible thing, and in fact, 70% of my community experiences it, and there's a good study around it, that's really great. Or if you can say, I experience X thing, and here are 100 sign-ons from that community, and you have their signatures, some other way to show that it's also in scale, that's like totally killer.
So what I love, there's a lot of work being done right now on storytelling out of a lot of places, but collective impact is one area. And what they say is to try to not only tell the problem story, but also tell the transformational story. And so to find a way to include what the best possible outcome would be for you, I think is a really beautiful way to not just leave the person you're trying to talk to and get to know you, like the hard part, but also provide a possible, like what would be the best possible outcome. So I'm trying to do that myself, kind of include the transformational story when I tell the story.
That's awesome, Megan. Thank you so much. So moving on, we talked about this a bit earlier. If you all have anything to add, please do. We talked about what is advocacy. What is advocacy? So Kimberly kicked us off with a very detailed definition. Kimberly, if you have anything to add, once again, please feel free to do so. So moving from there, knowing what is advocacy, how we get involved, how do students get engaged with advocacy, why is it important? Why does it even matter, right? So why is it important in the context of your work within public health? Why should we be advocating?
I'm taking notes because someone posted a question that I want to make sure we answer later. And it was something to the effect of, how do you convince someone that disagrees with you? So I just want to write that down. But to answer the question, why advocate? So this is organized for public health educators. And I suspect you have a lot in common with my folks who are college access and success professionals. And a lot of times people think of politics and advocacy as being icky. They don't want to touch it. Like, yucky, yucky. But I constantly, especially for us, because our programs that we work in are federally funded by the U.S. Department of Education. And so I constantly impress upon them, if you don't do this advocacy, the money will not be there to serve the students. And by the same token, the federal government funds the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Health and Human Services, so many different agencies that put monies into the work that you're doing, making sure public health is funded and that more money needs to be going into public health. The Department of Education is starting to put more money and funnel more money into the mental health services for students at the K-12 level. So the fact that you're out there doing the advocacy is so critical and important, because if not, that money is going to go elsewhere. I want to say this, don't quote me, the stat is wrong, but maybe about 3% of the federal spending goes to education. I mean, we've got a multi-trillion-dollar budget. There's money out there to be had. And if we're not out there asking for it, demanding it, someone's going to get it. So it's just as important as the work you're doing every day on the ground, in the streets, for the people you serve, to be doing it in Washington, D.C., in your state capitals. Because I'm telling you, the folks who represent the major airlines, the folks who represent corporations that are killing our planet, they're out there. We got to be there too.
This is awesome. I wish I had emojis, but imagine me clapping and smiling and laughing and fireworks going off. Thank you for that. Others, why should we be involved in public health advocacy?
Yeah, so I feel like public health advocacy is really important, especially for groups that are experiencing health disparities. I think a lot of the times, yes, stats are fantastic, but when you're in the communities that don't have a lot of research or funding going towards doing research, it's really hard to decide, this policy should pass because it affects the community, because you really don't have the proof except for the living proof of the people in the communities. So I feel like, especially for people in those communities, it's so important to have them advocate, because even if that's the only meeting, the 15 seconds you get in an elevator with someone to be like, hi, I'm trans, this is why this bill is important to me. When that bill comes up for vote, or that policy comes up for vote, hopefully that person remembers, hey, I remember I had this wacky elevator ride with this person and they're trans, so I actually want to think about this policy a little bit more, because I know that person's my constituent and they're going to be affected by this policy. So I think it's so important to just share those stories and make sure that they are holistic and encompassing of people from all walks of life, to make sure that, when we don't have those stats to hold up why policies need to pass or need to not pass, that our politicians and legislators are still realizing, yes, this affects my constituents, or it affects anyone, and I need to be more cognizant of that.
Thank you, Gabe. I'm looking at you, Megan, or Dan, do you have anything to add to that? Just why should we be advocating? Why can't I just hang out and watch TV or something? Why should I be advocating in whatever way I feel like I'm equipped to advocate?
Let me say that as a non-public health expert, so we represent college students, and all of our issues have public health angles, right? We have released studies on the cost of textbooks over the years, and found that Black and brown first generation low-income students are way more likely to skip buying a textbook, way more likely to skip meals because of the cost of materials, right? And students can tell that story, but I think public health experts can come in and add the impact of that, especially system-wide. Like we don't have that information, right? We represent students' voices. Another example is our campaign right now on COVID vaccination. We have a lot of young people who are questioning the impacts of the vaccine. A lot of them don't see the urgency, especially for their age group. We've called thousands of them, texted thousands of them. These are the responses we're getting. And, you know, we do the peer-to-peer thing. We say, oh, I also go to your college, so this is why I think that you should do it. And for some people, that's really compelling. But having literally this panel, like talk to students and go, hey, I think you should still. That would convince a whole set of people to actually do it. So you leverage your title, leverage your expertise, because nonprofit groups like ours need that. And we were calling for shutdowns and we were calling for mask mandates earlier in the pandemic. Hundreds of public health experts signed on to our letter. And when we lobbied with that, that was way more impactful than, you know, us just going, I think we should have masks maybe, right? So your voice actually makes a really huge impact on these campaigns.
Yeah, so I think the original question was why do advocacy? Why is this important? And I think there are a lot of people, just touching on what's been said by other panelists, that don't necessarily either have the skill set or they don't see themselves as an advocate, but they do experience good things when we advocate, right? So one of the constituents that I advocate for are kids, because they don't actually vote. So lots of policymakers don't actually care about children, which is mind-blowing when we state as a nation that there are high priority. When you look at policy, they actually aren't a high priority, not in funding, not in healthcare, not in a lot of things. And it's because they don't vote. So one of the reasons to be an advocate is to raise the voice and to raise the power of a community. And so when you become an advocate, you help add your voice to people who sometimes have so many other demands on their lives that don't always have that ability to advocate. So just kind of raising the awareness around something that sometimes could be harder for certain populations like children to do.
Oh, can I, Sabrina?
Yes, please go.
Let me jump in. Megan,
yes.
You said something so important. Not just the kids don't vote, and I'm going to say a very broad stroke thing that paints everybody. I apologize in advance, because there are a lot of great politicians out there doing good work, but kids don't vote. But for the most part, people in power know that their kids are going to be taken care of. Okay, the policies that they're making are not going to touch their children, because they are not reliant necessarily on public education. They're not reliant on public benefits. They're not reliant on food stamps. Their kids are going to be okay. So it's not personal. That's where the storytelling comes in. That's why it's so important. Their kids aren't necessarily going to be the ones who are going to need mental health counseling at a public center. Their kids aren't they're not probably first generation of college. Their parents can probably pay for them to go to school. That's where the advocacy comes in, because you stand where you sit where you stand where you sit. You know, whatever your background is, that's got to inform your choices. And so unless it's in your family or you've experienced it personally, you have to have somebody tell you about it. And that's why, you know, who votes? Senior citizens, okay? And so that's why a lot of the policies we're seeing going on, they really cater to what the oldest demographic cares about. And for some reason, they don't care about their grandchildren. But anyway, so that's an important point to consider when we're looking at policies overall. I did want to, if I could, go back to the piece of advocacy I talked about earlier about electioneering. Again, I know people think it's icky and, oh, I don't want to get involved, and campaigns are dirty. Let me tell you something. A lot of people who want to do a lot of good come from very poor communities, and they do not take money from corporate sources. And so it is incumbent upon those of us who want to see those people stay in office, people like, I'm making this up, but a Cori Bush, who will sleep on the Capitol steps for 5 days to prevent an eviction moratorium. We got to give to her campaign to keep her in office, if you want to keep her in office. Because I'm guessing, I don't know this, but I'm guessing she probably doesn't take corporate money. You know what I mean? So for a person like that, for her, fundraising is absolutely critical. So you can't just be like, oh, I don't give to politicians because, well, that's one politician who helped prevent the eviction moratorium from going away. So that's just an example of why it is important to be involved at all stages of advocacy and all parts of the political process. If there's a member you care about, you want to see them in a position to help you, you've got to help them stay in office. And it costs millions of dollars to run for Congress. That's why you have so many wealthy people. You don't make that much money running for office. You got to maintain 2 houses, one in your district and one in Washington, D.C. So it's incumbent upon us who want to keep people doing certain work. You got to support their campaigns because it is expensive. Sorry. Next question.
No apologies allowed. This is so good. You all are just so passionate, which is why you're here. You're so passionate about what you do, and you are, amazing. Thank you for everything that you do. So moving on, but advocacy is challenging, right? So how do you convince people who disagree with you? How do you advocate to those across the aisle or across the street or across the railroad tracks? What does that look like? And Dan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. So we're a nonpartisan group, which is really fun in this polarized atmosphere. And it really, is interesting because certain words you say even will indicate that you're part of one side or another. Like if I say we're running a justice campaign or we're running a freedom campaign, I bet all of you would assume certain things, right? And really, fundamentally, we should all be for justice and freedom, right? So it's a little, you have to think about what you're saying and not share your allegiances. I think that's the first thing because people will make judgments right off the bat. And the second thing is to really listen and try to repeat back the thing that they're saying and articulate it in a more compelling way than even they did. So what I'm hearing you're saying is, man, this happened and that happened. Yeah, I totally understand why vaccination would be totally scary. I hear that. So that will make sure that they're heard or clarify, right? Are you saying A or B? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? I'm not sure I understand. Really try to put yourself in their shoes. And then 3, make your case in a way that's non-accusatory and actually appeals to something they care about. I think that's hard in this day and age. We're really passionate about the things that we care about, right? And then I think the last thing is just leave the conversation if they're just going to disagree. So if you look at both public health and climate, there's like a range, right? There's the 10 or 20% on the edges that are just not movable. And then everyone else is in between is kind of immovable. You'll know quite quickly whether they're movable or not based on what they're saying, right? Some of the text messages we get about microchips, I'm like, okay, have a great day, goodbye. You're not someone I'm gonna move, right? So once you decide that they're actually movable, it's really an iterative process where you're listening, appealing to their personal interests to get them to agree with you. And honestly, it takes a really, really long time most of the time.
That's helpful just to think about, number one, the outliers, kind of leave the outliers there, right? And work on the people that you can sort of convince and inform, and then thinking about the time, the commitment that it takes. I think we've heard that several times. Megan, what are your thoughts on convincing people who disagree with us?
Yeah, so this is perfect because it's just right on, just piggybacking on the last comment. So I like to share with all my new advocates and with my veteran advocates the spectrum of allies. So I'll just have it put up right here for a second on our screens. And basically the notion is that we are all on a range of how much we support or not. And I do think that's going to come up soon, the spectrum of allies slide. But essentially it's kind of what Dawn was talking about, which is you don't necessarily, I think when we think about advocacy, we think we have to convince our exact opposite opponent, someone who is just 100% in disagreement with us, right? Yeah, here we go. So we always think about, when we're thinking about advocacy, we think about this active opposition. So we think about the people that are literally going to yell in our faces against whatever we are supporting. And what we know about conversations and moving people's minds and things like that is that we actually get a lot out of just moving people from neutral into passive support. So that would mean someone who is just kind of not engaged with the issue. There's someone who's like, I don't really get into that. And if you can just move them to like, oh, maybe it isn't fair that children don't have enough food to eat on a day-to-day basis, right? If you can just get them there, that takes way less energy and gets you way bigger reward than you spending your entire day working with the active opposition who are like, no, children deserve to be hungry, it's their fault, right? You're never going to get anywhere with that. And so this, for me, really helped me as being a newer advocate kind of conceptualize where I wanted to sort of strategically focus my energy. Of course, we want to bring those absolute disagreeers over all the way. But if we can move someone even from passive opposition, like, I don't think kids should have things, to like, I just don't care about it, that's even a win, right? And so thinking about how to strategically move people, it's not necessarily you have to change their mind. And I just want to touch on something Don said too, which is when we have a conversation, we actually think we have to say things in order to convince someone of something different. And it's weird, it's human psychology, but if we listen more, they're actually more likely to agree with us. It's so weird. It's like, it seems counterintuitive, but so the more listening you do and sort of asking them probing questions, they'll catch themselves. If there's some kind of logical error in their thinking, if you let them talk about it, they'll catch themselves. And man, that's more effective than you saying, ha, got you. And so I think that's two approaches to kind of disagreeing in advocacy.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Megan.
If I could just add one other idea, I love that chart, and I totally agree. If you know somebody's in that bright red column, you maybe don't want to waste too much time there, but sometimes you don't want to make assumptions. You do your research and know where people stand, but don't assume because there's an R or a D next to somebody's name, you know where they stand, because there's a spectrum even within the parties of ideology. And so, you might get someone, and sometimes their support, I've had members say, I can't vote for this for you, but I'll have a conversation with somebody who can help you with this. So there's all different levels of support. So don't preemptively decide that you can't win on an issue, or there aren't other ways to get support on a particular issue.
Thank you for that, Kimberly. So moving on, how do you help community members participate in advocacy efforts in their local communities? And we'll start with Gabe here.
Yeah, so this has definitely looked very different depending on kind of the position that I've been in. So I think definitely when I was younger, I was very much involved in the community, in my Salt Lake City community. And so my peers were definitely the ones, being targeted by the tobacco industry. And so it's pretty easy to be like, hey, you know what? Have you seen these advertisements before? Or have you heard of electronic cigarettes before? And just have those conversations peer to peer, kind of what Megan was saying. And I think, after moving on to university and now working for the National LGBT Cancer Network, a lot of my work has kind of shifted to be national work, where we're still helping people on local levels, so state level, and also city level as well. And I think something that's been so fascinating about that work is that we have a program called Out Proud Free, which is all about educating people about tobacco's influence in the LGBTQ community. And so through that, we've been able to kind of partner with different organizations across the country and basically be like, yeah, do you have people in your community who are queer identified, who maybe have a tobacco story, or who are just kind of upset about policies that, Philip Morris and all these other companies have had in place? And what we do is we collect their stories, we turn them into videos, we turn them into Instagram posts, and we share them with local health departments who are trying to pass policies, or with organizations, or sometimes with the White House too, to be like, hey, this is a huge problem, you need to do something about it. And so I think just making sure that people's stories once again get heard, but then that it's also a tool that is available on their local community level that they can pull out to be like, hey, I can show this to my school board, or I can show this to my city council. And so I think making sure that materials are also available, especially when we have real local people involved in them, I think that's so crucial.
Yeah, so I think I will add to that, touching back on the concept first of relationships. And this is different from relationships with a policymaker or someone you're trying to change some kind of perspective on. I think that advocacy work is actually really hard. It's wonderful and rewarding sometimes, but I think, and I'm going to butcher this quote, but there's a famous quote that says, in order to do this work, you have to be prepared to lose joyfully over and over and over again until one day someone 100 years from now can win because of all your losses. And I just think of that, and I think about how particularly newer advocates can feel really overwhelmed by getting the loss, right? They did all this work, they felt excited, and then they don't get what they were hoping for. And so I think one is relationships between the community members. So I spend a lot of time in local work, particularly just making sure we're all cool with each other, right? We all care about each other. We all feel connected. We all want to see each other, because the work outside of this space sometimes really sucks and it's really hard. And it can be easy to say, I'm out. This is too much. It's stressful. I'm done. And those relationship connections in that community space can keep people there, because it's still motivating to be with people you care about and to do things that other people that you care about are doing. So that's my one key for how to do this. And then the next is providing opportunities. And this is something, Gabe, I think you were saying, for sort of small, easy wins, because the bigger advocacy work is often full of losses. So if we're thinking about something small, we can do like, hey, can you call up 5 of your friends and tell them to come to our next meeting? Well, that's probably something that's possible. And then that advocate feels like, oh, I did something and I have 5 people this meeting. That's awesome. And that kind of gives them that momentum, because if you just say, okay, go talk to your federal congressperson and ask them to change this policy, they're likely going to get a no a few times. And so if you can kind of work up small wins and keep people kind of feeling the momentum towards the greater goal, I think those are the 2 things that are best for community members, because otherwise what happens is they disengage because the work is hard or it doesn't feel like they're getting anything done.
Okay, before we move on, I know we have one question, another question from our viewers, and then we have our final question. So before we move on to the most successful advocacy effort, do you all have any more comments on engaging community members in local efforts? Okay, so why don't you all chime in? What's been your most successful advocacy effort?
I'm gonna talk about our antibiotics campaign. I think everybody here knows that antibiotics overuse is a huge problem, and that we see some massive resistance all across the country and the world. And there's some predictions. The WHO predicts that by 2050, antibiotic resistance will kill more people than cancer, which is horrifying. But what most people don't know is that 70% of antibiotics use in the US is on factory farms to make animals that are not sick fatter, basically, so they can keep them in horrible conditions, and that can jump to human diseases. And so 5 years ago, 3% of the chicken market in the United States was raising meat without the overuse of antibiotics. Today, 98% of the chicken market is raised on meat raised without the overuse of antibiotics. And we did it by going after big fast food chains. So Subway, McDonald's, Wendy's just this summer, KFC, all tons of, we were like, I don't buy very much chicken, so I can't really move the market. So who does? So we went, all right, let's get the fast food chains. So that was one of our most successful campaigns in the last decade, for sure.
Real quick, in 2018, my program was we're federally funded. And so we were barreling towards the end of the federal fiscal year. We were up for a $60 million funding increase. The House, I think both the House and the Senate were Republican controlled. And an amendment was put forward by a Republican House member, who's no longer in Congress, to take our $60 million. And so we cobbled together a bipartisan coalition of Republicans and Democrats when the amendment moved forward to the floor vote, and we defeated the amendment by 110 votes. That was pretty gnarly. And we got our $60 million.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely just would reiterate the Utah Indoor Clean Air Act and having that expanded. And I think that was back in 2012, 2013. And then I moved to Minnesota for a few years, and we worked on a lot of flavored tobacco policy restrictions, so including menthol, like bubblegum flavor, pina colada flavor, those types of products. And then also raising the age to 21 to purchase tobacco products in some of those cities as well.
Awesome, Gabe. And then Megan, do you have anything you'd like to share in terms of your... So our final question for the afternoon or evening, depending on where you're chiming in from. I know this is very sad for you. I know you just want us here for another hour, but we want to let our panelists move on with their days. So what do you think is or are the most pressing issues that everyone should be aware of and involved in related to advocacy? So the most pressing issue or the most pressing issues that everyone should be involved in and aware of related to advocacy?
I would say voter suppression. That's the most fundamental, that's where it starts. I mean, if you don't have access to the vote, that impacts the ability to affect everything else. So that's what I would say.
Climate change, but then I almost think issues are less important as much as can you double yourself or triple yourself or recruit more people? Because regardless of what issue you care about, we need like 100,000 more people in the movement on all these issues. It's not going to work with everyone on this live stream and on this call. So like whatever you're doing, go have someone else shadow you, and that will be more impactful.
Yeah, I guess my answer is going to be kind of a cop-out answer, but I'm going to say social determinants of health. I think a lot of the times, especially in tobacco work and in cancer work, I remind people, like, yeah, we want to pass this policy, but did you show up last week when we were working on non-discrimination? Or did you show up when we were working on mental health access? And I think, it's becoming more and more of an issue. And I think a lot more people are realizing social determinants of health really do play a huge role in health outcomes. And so I think, definitely just being aware of social determinants of health and then trying to mitigate them as much as possible.
I'm so glad you copped out, because I am also going to cop out and say that there's not necessarily one thing I can say is the most pressing issue. Like I mentioned earlier, I feel like there's a lot of fires. And so if there's a fire that you're particularly concerned about and you have a lot of passion, that's where you should go. I think all the issues that were just mentioned are absolutely key advocacy issues. And then I'll just plug children one more time. We have children that folks just don't seem to worry about, who are not able to live a free, healthy, safe life with the best possible outcomes in front of them. And so I would say that's one of the fires I look at, but all the fires that have been mentioned are important. And I would just say, if you feel particularly connected to one, go for it, fight that fire. And I shouldn't say that in the West Coast right now, because we're just not doing well with that. So I'm sorry.
Thank you all again for that. I just want to say, on behalf of Sophe, I want to thank our presenters and everyone for joining us today. This has been amazing. I'm so excited, and even more so looking forward to the upcoming Advocacy Summit. Again, this is just a primer for what you'll get. Not if, but when you attend the summit. This is just the teaser for what it's going to be like for us. So the live stream event today was recorded and will be available on Sophe's YouTube channel. Our next live stream event will be held on Thursday, September 9th at 3 p.m. We hope that you'll come back and join us again, and also bring a friend. So thank you once again. We appreciate you all for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks at our next event.
Thank you.